So, for this interview project, I decided to tackle the topic of apartheid, which occurred in South Africa from the early 1940s until the mid 1990s. My informant for this interview was Megan DeLong. She's a 22-year-old female who was born and raised in Johannesburg, South Africa, which she currently resides there today. But she's been in the United States and New Jersey studying at Monmouth University for the past 5 years. She's a senior this year, and she also plays on the women's field hockey team, which is how I know her. So my goal for interviewing Megan was basically just to get a grasp on her knowledge of the subject, specifically targeting how she was educated on the subject, her relatives' experiences living in South Africa at the time, and how South Africa still continues to be affected by apartheid some 25 years later from it ending. So before I started the interview, I asked Megan her family history, basically, of South Africa, because I wanted to know how, if her relatives, her parents and great grandparents were around in South Africa during the time of apartheid. So I asked how far back in history her family had lived in South Africa, to which she replied, "As far as I know, my grandparents' great grandparents are the furthest back in history I know." So this allowed me to understand that her relatives had lived through and experienced apartheid. But she does go into further detail about later in the interview. So to begin, I asked Megan, how would you or someone from your country define apartheid? How were you taught about it in school? She replied, "We learned about it twice in school, but in junior school it is not as detailed as it would be in our high schools. Basically, in junior school we learned about the principle of it and not much else because we were still very young. But once we get to high school, they teach us in very specific detail and they do not sugarcoat anything. I think that after our schooling, someone from my country would define apartheid as radical segregation and discrimination, but in all spheres of life. The apartheid government would literally make laws for almost anything you could think of in favor of the white citizens in South Africa." So basically, this told me that it's very clear that Megan's education on apartheid is extensive, which is understandable considering the amount of time that they spend on the topic of apartheid in schools and how young they are when they first are introduced to the topic. Next, I asked Megan, while you were not alive during this time period of apartheid, considering she's only 22, your parents and great-grandparents did live through and experience this time in South Africa. So I asked her she could tell me a little bit about what life was like for them during this time. To which she replied, "I know for a fact that my grandpa participated in many protests that occurred during the time of apartheid. He got arrested at the protests, and he was also a part of a club in his college that was very against the system in place. They would actually teach what they were learning in school to black college-aged kids. It also affected my dad in a different way. So Megan's dad played for the South African national field hockey team. She states that my dad has only received 3 caps, which is 3 games played, for our national team, even though he's on the national team for 4 or 5 years. During the time that he was on the team, every other country refused to play South African sport. So my dad has only 3 caps, even though he's on the team for 4+ years. So even though the players on sporting teams weren't directly affected by apartheid in the sense of discrimination, and even though they were all white, there were still consequences for them, which I don't think that the countries that refused to play them were wrong either." So Megan makes it very clear that her family's hardships are very minimal compared to the non-white citizens in South Africa at the time. And she emphasizes to me multiple times throughout the interview how privileged she is just based on the color of her skin. But it also says that it wasn't just people of color that were affected by South Africa, or by apartheid in South Africa, but it was everyone in the country that somehow was affected. It was like there were consequences for them during the apartheid time in South Africa. So the next question I asked Megan was, is there any specific law or laws that were established at the time that stuck out to you or had any significance on your country as a whole? She states that the Bantu Education Act was so outrageous to me. This was put into place in 1953, and they would obviously separate schools between whites and non-whites, which is wrong to begin with. But to make it even worse was the white schools had these amazing facilities and really great teachers and were taught really well. The schools that the non-whites went to, they would learn menial tasks like minimum wage worker tasks. So basically, the way that it was set up was awful because it went on for so many years. And so by the time that apartheid ended, there were all these white people going to college and getting great education and great degrees, whereas every other person got poor education for 40 plus years. And so it was so hard to undo this institutionalized racism at this point, and that's why you still see it today. This law sticks out to me the most because I feel like education is such a powerful thing to have. So by taking that away from someone, it can ruin someone's entire life. So the next question that I wanted to ask Megan was about if there's any consequences, which she already talks about in the question before, but if there's any consequences of apartheid affecting society today. Because I believe that Megan is in a very unique position to have grown up in South Africa and then spend her college years in the United States. Specifically being white, I mainly asked to see if there was, and if she has noticed after spending her 5 years in America, any parallels between the United States and South Africa in the way that people view race and the separation of races. So I asked her, while apartheid ended in the early 1990s, the economic and social effects are still seen today. So I asked her to elaborate on this and how has apartheid affected South Africa some 25 plus years later. To which she replies, I see a lot of the same things here as I did back home. So while the situations are not necessarily the same, I see a lot of responses that are similar. For example, the way that people respond to the Black Lives Matter protests is the same way that people would respond to something like that at home. She says, oh, it ended a long time ago. Oh, that's not racist, it's just a stereotype, or it's just a joke. You don't realize how much it is ingrained in society until you actually think about it. She goes on to state that the white population in South Africa is only 10%, so 90% of our population is either black or people of color. Of that 10% of white people, there's a very, very tiny amount that are below middle class. It is so very rare to be white and poor in South Africa. So there's so much poverty and wage gap issues today. Society in South Africa is set up against people of color. It's nearly impossible to reverse a system that is set up like that. So basically, I really enjoyed working on this project. I thought that Megan was a wonderful informant, and she obviously knows a great deal about the subject at hand, which is why it was great to be able to have worked with her. A quote that stuck out to me specifically that she stated was, I wasn't born into the apartheid system, but I've already benefited from it just because my parents benefited from it and their parents benefited from it. So I thought that Megan was in a pretty special position to be able to talk about this subject while being white, because I could see the different sides of obviously how traumatic and horrible it is being white in South Africa at that time, or being black in South Africa at the time. But Megan's side of it is also kind of like a cool experience to be able to talk to her about it. I thought it was very interesting to have studied something that also involves real life issues from around the world, and I thought it was kind of like a privilege to have talked to Megan about this pretty serious subject. So thank you.